to Bethlehem and see him whose birth the angels see. Come adore on bended knee, Christ the Lord, the newborn King. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Good evening, and welcome to Rainier Avenue Church. We have services in the morning usually, so I almost never say good evening. It's kind of strange for me to do that. My name is Pastor Peter Chin. I'm one of the pastors here at the church, and we are really glad to be able to invite you into our house for this important night with Mark Charles and together as a community. I'm here to give just an opening welcome to us and also to let you know about the facilities. And then we're going to be entering into time of prayer together, led by a friend of ours. In terms of our facility, I don't think there are any young children here, but we don't have children's ministry working today, but we do have spaces. And so there's a space behind us in the sanctuary or another room on the side if you'd like to go there. The bathrooms are just outside through the lobby and around in this hallway over here. So feel free to use them as you'd like. After the lecture in our lobby, that's where you'll be able to pick up books that Mark will be selling and signing as well. And so that'll be happening out in the lobby after the lecture. With that, I just wanted to give a quick introduction before Jeannie came up and blessed us. One of the things that we did in preparation for this day is we showed a short video of Mark in one of the promotional videos that he gives to let people know about what he's going to come and speak about. And in it, he was relating about what it feels like to him to be a Native American, to be Navajo, but also to be a citizen of the United States. And the way he described it is that it feels like having this beautiful, large house that a grandmother owns, and then someone just comes in and forces you upstairs into the basement and locks you in there. And I just thought that was it humanizes it, because we all understand that. No matter what culture you're from, if someone just came and pushed you into a certain place of your home, that kind of hits home for all of us. But then what he said on top of that is the worst part is that no one comes into the room and just says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be. Thank you for sharing this space with us. And so we wanted to start just by saying thank you to Mark, to the people of the Navajo Nation, but also to people who are here from Haida, Apache, Yakima. We have many representatives of Native people who are here. And so as people who have come into this house late, whether it's the last 30 years in terms of me, or for some of us 200 years, we're here to say thank you. And thank you, and we're here to learn. We're here to learn. And our Derek Kamwesa will be giving our formal land acknowledgement as part of that as well. Part of who we are is we are followers of Christ, and prayer is a big part of how we center ourselves for good, hard family conversations. And so we're going to ask a dear sister of ours, Jeannie Jimenez, to come up and to give our blessing for this night. Can we welcome her up as she does?
Appreciate a hand when walking upstairs. You never know. So, in my native language, the prayer I am praying are some words I learned from my maternal grandmother, who prayed like 20 minutes, but this is only going to be like 3 or 4. And both grandmothers spoke fluent Haida, although they weren't allowed to speak it in their schools, as most of you have heard that story. They never forgot it, of course, and we heard them, we grew up with it, but they didn't teach it to us. But what I know is just what I remember hearing them say. So the first thing my Nana always said was, Hai, Sithgang Dlingusu Tsin. Let's bow our heads in reverence. Kli Salana, Tangant Hilagan, Sanang Itlak Das, Itla Sankudang. Lord, your spirit is all around us. You are the rich one on high, and we ask you for your mercy. Kli salana dik hyadang, lau it kwiat kla gangang. I love you, Lord, and you first loved me. Our community, Iskyan, our families, Tla'ath Hutsiasu, Dangant Ginangang, Haua Salana. I ask that you watch over our community and our families. Haua Sahu Dang Hidang. You are a great and mighty God. Amen.
Thank you, Jeannie. Good evening. My name is Derek Kamwesa, and I serve on staff here as our Director of Justice and Spirituality Ministries. And so it's an honor and a joy to welcome you here, but to also just appreciate the fact that this evening you took the time to be with us. As Pastor Peter said, I think it's fitting that we give the land acknowledgement of the land that we as guests and visitors do stand on. So we here at Rainier Avenue Church acknowledge that we worship on the unceded traditional land of the coastal Salish peoples, specifically the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, original stewards of the land, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. We also do recognize that this acknowledgement is just one step, and we pray God would give us to guide us to be a church that continues to grow in the work of spirituality and justice as they go hand in hand together. Amen? Amen. Well, in that frame of mind, justice and spirituality is something that we believe and we honor, and that's why my role is called Director of Justice and Spirituality here at Rainier Avenue Church. On the side here, you will see we have a banner that says Christian spirituality will lead us to God's heart for justice, and our pursuit of justice must be rooted in our Christian spirituality. That means our pursuit of justice must be rooted in our pursuit of God's heart for justice is the fact that we set ourselves up in a place of learning, in a posture of learning. So tonight, I'm asking you to set your heart and your mind in a posture of learning. We're going to hear some truths. We're going to hear some hard truths. But may we develop a posture of learning. There's an African proverb that says, education is learning a lot about how little you know. The first step towards education is to admit that we don't know. The second step is to be open to learn. And the third step is to let go of what is not true. George Erasmus of the Dene Nation of Canada, he says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is formed, common memory must be created. And Mark Charles, our speaker tonight, is passionate about creating common memory as he works to build a healthier national community, especially across racial lines. Mark is the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man. Mark is a graduate of UCLA, and he works as an author, a speaker, a podcaster, an activist, a preacher, consultant. He wears a lot of hats. He is one of the leading authorities on the 15th century doctrine of discovery. And in 2019, he co-authored a book, the award-winning book, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. Mark co-founded a national conference for Native students called Would Jesus Eat Fried Bread? And in 2012, he hosted in front of the US Capitol a public reading of the National Apology to the Native Peoples of the United States that the 112th Congress gave, but then buried in the 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act. In 2020, this is one that I didn't even know, Mark ran as an independent candidate for the President of the United States with the platform of building a nation where we, the people, actually means all people. Mark is a dual citizen of the United States and of the Navajo Nation, and he works tirelessly to initiate a national dialogue on race, gender, and class, a conversation he hopes will be par on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada. He's currently working on his second book, Decolonizing Faith. His TED Talk, The Truth Behind We the People, has had over 300,000 views, and he has been featured on numerous media outlets, including PBS, NewsHour, CNN. We could just go on and on. Mark is a gifted communicator who loves a good cup of coffee and regularly combines these passions as he interviews guests and shares them on his podcast, My Second Cup of Coffee. So we are honored I could go on and tell you many different stories. We were blessed as a staff to be under his tutelage at the CCDA conference, and we thought, how amazing would it be for our church and our community to hear some of this? So please put your hands together and welcome Mark Charles, our speaker tonight.
Yat my relatives. Yat Mark Charles Yinishya. Sin Bakadina Nishla, Dr. Higlini Bash's Chin, Sin Bakadina Dasha Chater to the cheating Dashanala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineals of people. Our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother's American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sin Bakadina Nishla. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbakadina'a. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, which is the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I'm grateful that we've already done a land acknowledgement, and I just want to state how humbled I am to be walking on the lands of the indigenous peoples of this area. It is always humbling to remind ourselves that these lands weren't discovered and they weren't empty. There were many, many nations and peoples here hunting, fishing, farming, raising their families and burying their dead here, and they are still here. And I want to honor all of the host nations of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands and just, again, remember how humbling it is to be moving, breathing, and living on these lands today. So we have about 75 to 90 minutes tonight to talk. I'm going to be talking some about the book that I co-authored, Unsettling Truths, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. I also have some copies of these books for sale afterwards. I do have what I call my book study special, where if you buy 10 signed copies of my book, you can either buy them from me here tonight or you can buy them online from my website. But if you buy 10 signed copies from me for the purpose of doing a book study for your Sunday school class or your organization or just a group of friends, I will give your study a free virtual 45-minute Q&A. At some time over the next year, you can schedule that with my assistant and we'll jump on a Zoom call and have a very good dialogue. I love these conversations. I do about 2 or 3 of these a month, and they're almost the highlight of my month. After our discussion here, I think we're doing some Q&A, but I could almost script right now the questions you're going to ask because I know your responses. And the questions you ask right after the event are very different than the questions you ask after you get a few REM cycles in you. And then your questions even a few months or days or weeks later will be very different after you've let that kind of seep in and you've really pondered it for a while. And so I try to, because I usually only get the very immediate Q&As. I don't get the later ones. And so the book study is a great way for me to have a conversation with people who've read the book, they've discussed it, and now they have some questions to ask. I am also fairly active on Patreon, which is a subscription social media website. And on my Patreon site, I have several tiers. One of them is the Ask Questions tier. And on the Ask Questions tier, once a month, this month in December, we're doing it on December 22nd, I have a public Q&A on my Patreon. And so even if tonight, right, you aren't able to ask the question you wanted to ask, or you don't even have it formed until a few days or a few weeks later, you can always jump on my Patreon, subscribe even for just the 1 month, and then join the Q&A and have the Q&A there and ask your question there. I try to do as much as I can to engage the dialogue as many places as I can, even after I speak, because I know a lot of thoughts will come to you later. As was mentioned, I am currently co-authoring a second book. That book is called Decolonizing Faith. It's a part 2 to Unsettling Truths. Not part 2 in that it extends the story, but part 2 in that it assumes people have read or are exposed and know what the doctrine of discovery is. I'm not repeating myself. So the doctrine, or my current book, Unsettling Truths, it critiques the way the church and the nation have co-opted the scriptures and used it towards their political and military ends and economic ends. So we critique the United States with what they did with Manifest Destiny or what they did with enslavement of African people, but we don't critique the command God gave in Deuteronomy when he told Israel to go into their promised lands and kill everybody. We don't critique that, at least not in this book. But in Decolonizing Faith, I am critiquing that. And I'm looking at how do the Christian scriptures themselves lend to a colonial, vindictive, and violent worldview? And what does that mean for our faith? And so tomorrow morning, I'm preaching at New Light Fellowship Church, which is just around the corner from here, about 2 blocks away. And I'm preaching the first chapter of that book. It's called Radical Inclusivity, based on Acts 10. And it looks at the distinction between how Jesus was radically inclusive of Jews and Samaritans, and yet held Gentiles at arm's length. And what does that mean? And the reason I'm asking this question, because I have a very strong critique of the Old Testament, but if I just go into the Old Testament, you all would just say, well, Jesus is different. So I have to take that argument away from you in the first chapter. It's not bad news, but it's looking at the scriptures in a very honest way that we're not prone to do when we're raised in the church. So I'll be preaching on that tomorrow morning if you want to come and hear the first chapter of that book in the morning. I'm currently still writing it. It's not finished yet, but I'm hoping it will be out in early 2026. Finish it hopefully this next year and then get it published in about 1.5 years from now. But anyway, I'm also in the back of my head writing a third book, which I'm calling Decolonizing Health. And that's what I want to bring into our discussion tonight. I want to spend about half of our time, 35, 40 minutes, talking about the doctrine of discovery and what it is. Some of it you may have heard before. And I want to spend the other 30 to 40 minutes talking about how that has impacted our health. And what does it look like to begin to work to decolonize our health? Now, if you're meeting me for the first time, many of you don't know this, but over the past 1.5 years, about 1.5 years ago, I had my left hip replaced. And I took some time to rehabilitate that afterwards. And during COVID, I got arthritis pretty bad in this hip. And during COVID, both my daughters decided they wanted to play basketball. And I love basketball. I played it and coached it when I was younger, and I always thought I could pick it up again. And when they asked to play, I went out to play with them, and I couldn't because I couldn't run. And I was devastated. And so we tried physical therapy, we tried steroid shots, nothing worked. We finally decided to do the surgery. And I told the nurse, I told my physical therapist, I told my doctor, I said, I'm doing this because I'm never going to take my health for granted again. I missed an opportunity to play basketball with my daughters. I'm not going to miss more things like that. And so over the past 1.5 years, I have been working tirelessly to reclaim my health. I've lost 50 pounds. I've changed nearly every aspect of my life. I tell my wife and my kids I probably add, for better or for worse, 10 years to my life in the last year. And as I went through this process, and as I tried to make sense of all of the health information that's out there, and anyone ever try to get healthy, right? Is it easy? Is this something that you can just pick up a book and say, oh, this is good, we figured it out, right? No, it's overwhelming, right? It's overwhelming what we have to try and do with our health, because health is hard. We have a lot of different books, we have a lot of different opinions, we have a lot of different medical ideas, we have a lot of different experts, and we have all these different authors. And it's overwhelming, right? So we have books like this, which is the 5 a.m. Club, which I actually did a podcast after I read this book. I called it Toxic Positivity. And a lot of these books they're toxic positivity. They basically say if you figure out this one thing, if you do this one thing, your life is going to be well, you're going to live until you're 200 years old, you're going to be rich and prosperous and beautiful. And I mean, it's just over the top. And then you have so many other books. You have books written by doctors and experts. And all of these people, they almost say the same thing. They're like, well, if you just do my one thing, if you just sleep better, if you just breathe better, if you just stop eating processed foods, if you just get your circadian rhythm back, or if you stop using seed oils, or if you just do these different things, right? We hear every book is like this. They say, if you just do this one thing and just act in this one way. And the books are written. Some of them are written by journalists, and I actually like the books by the journalists the best because they actually go in and they research it, and they're like trying to figure out what's going on, and they approach it like a journalist would, and they really kind of go on a journey to understand that health condition better. Then you have some books written by doctors, and those can be good or bad because sometimes it's a doctor who found their thing that's going to cure the world, and now they have this great product that they want to sell you, and they have this great app that they want you to use. But many of the doctors who are writing these books, they say things like, well, I got into medicine because I wanted to help make people healthy, and I realize I'm a part of a system that makes money off keeping them sick. And, right, so you go into the doctor and there's a billing code to give you a prescription. There's a billing code to give you a procedure. There's no billing code to talk about overall health. And then, I mean, who many of you have a long, extended conversation with your primary care doctor, right? I mean, those just go on for hours, don't they? I mean, they're in and out in like 3 or 6 minutes. I mean, these are quick interactions. You can barely catch their name unless you pat it on the back with a Post-it note. I mean, it's hard to get this. And so some of these doctors write books, and they talk about some stuff. And there was one, it was actually the doctor who wrote Good Energy, and they had one of the most fascinating statements. And I have to tell you, I'm not going to pretend to give you medical advice. I want to share with you some of the stuff I've read and some of the stuff I've learned and some of the stuff I've applied to my own life. But we all need to make these decisions ourselves with our families and with our own physicians. So I'm not giving you medical advice here, but I just want you to share with you some of my own journey. But I think it was the doctor who wrote Good Energy, or it might have been another of the books. One of the things they said, because of the way the healthcare system can be so broken, they said, absolutely trust your doctor when you have an acute position or condition. When you have something that's threatening your life and you want your doctor to extend your life, they have been trained how to keep you alive for at least another 24 hours, right? They have some really good... He said, but if you have a chronic disease, you need to question everything your doctor says. Because again, the system isn't there. I'm not going to judge the doctors, but the system isn't there to make you healthy. The system is there to keep you alive and to make money. And so if you have an acute position or condition, absolutely, let them do what they do really, really, really well. If you have a chronic problem, you have to really question them and press them. And I found that really kind of and in my own experience, as I've read through a lot of these things, it's really fascinating. And of course, we have all these books on longevity, right? If you just do this thing, you're going to live forever, and we're going to soon have all this. And then there's a few books that I found are really paradigm shifting. The book Why We Get Fat, I'm going to talk about this more towards the end of our time here, is a very fascinating book that I've read. The Comfort Crisis, which talks about how we don't fail enough and we need to actually challenge ourselves more. I found that was really interesting. And then we have books like this that are just wildly, they kind of grab your imagination, but they have this really great story behind it, but they give you none of the technique. And so if anyone's ever tried barefoot running, from this book, right? The book probably inspired you to go barefoot running, but gave you no clue how to do it. And so you end up getting injured. Anyone get injured, right? I mean, from barefoot running? This is why so many doctors are down on barefoot running, because the people who read this book and then run outside barefoot and they get injured, the only people the doctors see are the ones who get the shin or the ankle injuries. And yeah, so we have a lot of different kind of books. And the problem is we don't know what to do with these books. How do we even begin to sort through them? And if you read these books long enough, and if you read enough of these books, you will know that the standard that most of the authors either explicitly or implicitly refer to as the gold standard of health throughout human history is the hunter-gatherer. The hunter-gatherer who moved constantly throughout the day, gathering roots, hunting animals. They were constantly in motion. They had very healthy lifestyles. And there's very few hunter-gatherers left today, and the Hazda are one of the few hunter-gatherer tribes left in the world today, and they're based in Tanzania. And I feel really sorry for these people, because every author who's written a book has gone and poked them and prodded them and had them pee in a cup and done some kind of study. And they all say, we tested the Hazda people. We ran this test on the Hazda people. We looked at the hunter-gatherer Hazda people, and we did, and you just hear this over and over and over again. Rarely do the books say, we had a conversation with the Hazda. We talked with them. We actually hunted with them and gathered with them. And that's what I want to talk with you about tonight. We're going to talk some about discovery, but then I want to have a discussion about the distinction between what I would call scientific data versus indigenous wisdom. And how does our mentality of discovery not only destroy our health, but put us in a place where we don't know what it means to be healthy or to get healthy again? This is one of the books I'm going to talk to you about more at the end. I've read every book I showed you up there, plus many, many others over the past year and a half. When I first read this book, Move Your DNA by Katie Bowman, she's a biomechanist, I literally took a week off of work. Her book was such an unbelievable paradigm shift for me that I took a week off of work. I read it like 2 times just so I could let her paradigm seep into my understanding of what it meant to be healthy and how to live healthy. One of the things she talks about is the distinction between exercise versus movement. You know, so many of us, we have our picture of old age is you kind of have the hunchback, your arms are in front of you, and you move slowly. And we see that, and that's become our picture of what it means to grow old. She says, but since we were 5, we train our children to sit in desks with their hands in front of them. And then they type on their computers in junior high and high school. And then they drive in their cars and they sit at their dinner tables. And then they get jobs sitting at desks. Their arms are always in front of them. Their knees are always bent. She said, this isn't the picture of old age. This is the picture of sitting on your butt and having your arms in front of you for 50 years for 12 hours a day. And then we think we're going to fix that by exercising for 30 minutes 3 times a week. And it's like, that's absurd. Not that exercise is bad, but that's not going to counter 14 hours a day of this. She actually talks about the hunter-gatherers in a much more holistic way and even holds up some of that picture there. And I'm going to use her book throughout this talk, but her book was, and I'm going to quote it several times, it was a massive paradigm shift for me as I began going through this journey of even looking at my own health. And if we're going to talk about colonization and health and decolonizing health, we have to understand what we're decolonizing from. What impact does colonization have on our health? And I want to talk about this book by a man named George Catlin. It was written in the 1840s or 50s. He was a contemporary of Lewis and Clark. He actually knew Clark. I think he worked for him, or at least he was connected with him when he was working for the BIA, I think it was. George Catlin met him. But George Catlin went west of the Mississippi, and he went west for about 6 years, longer than Lewis and Clark did, traveled more miles than they did, and met many, many, many more nations. He didn't go to subjugate people. He didn't go to discover lands. He didn't go to find some secret route to the Pacific. He went to meet the native peoples of this continent and lived among dozens of tribes for over half a decade. He was also an artist, and he gives us some of the best pictures of pre-colonial, pre-white settlement native life that we have. One of the most complete collections of images that we have of people who had not yet been colonized by Western Europeans. And he had chronic health problems most of his life as well, including the fact that he had a really hard time breathing. And when he went out and lived among the people of the Western Plains, and later he actually went down to South America, he wrote some stuff, and I want to actually read this for you because it's about 4 or 5 paragraphs, but I want to read it for you because it will give you a picture of what life was like before colonization. So let me just bring this up real quick on my thing so I can see it. I can't see that screen quite as well as I want to. So I'm going to bring this up on my screen as well so I can read this for you. I'll put it on the screen, but you won't be able to see the words because it's fairly... There we go. So let me read this for you. He went up to the Missouri to live with the Lakota Sioux. He met with the Pawnee, the Omaha, the Cheyenne, the Blackfeet. Along the banks of the upper Missouri, he happened upon the civilization of the Mandan, a mysterious tribe whose members stood 6 feet tall and lived in bubble-shaped houses. Many had luminous blue eyes and snow-white hair. Catlin realized that nobody really knew about the Mandan or other Plains tribes because no one of European descent had bothered to spend time talking to them, researching them, living with them, and listening to their beliefs and traditions. I am traveling this country, as I have before said, not to advance or to prove theories, but to see all I am able to see and to tell it in the simplest and most intelligible manner I can to the world for their own conclusion, Catlin wrote. He would paint some 600 portraits and take hundreds of pages of notes, forming what famed author Peter Madison would call the first, last, and only complete record ever made of the Plains Indians at the height of their splendid culture. The tribes varied region by region with different customs, traditions, and diets. Some, like the Mandan, only ate buffalo, flesh, and maize, while others lived primarily on venison and water, and still others harvested plants and flowers. The tribes looked different too, with varying hair colors, facial features, and skin tones. And yet Catlin marveled at the fact that all 50 tribes seemed to share the same superhuman physical characteristics. In some groups, such as the Crow and the Osage, Catlin wrote, there were few men at their full growth who are less than 6 feet in stature, and very many of them 6.5, and others 7 feet. They all seem to share a Herculean make of broad shoulders and barreled chests. The women were nearly as tall and just as striking. Having never seen a dentist or doctor, the tribal people had teeth that were perfectly straight, as regular as the keys of a piano, Catlin noticed. Nobody seemed to get sick, and deformities and other chronic health problems appeared rare or non-existent. The tribes attributed their vigorous health to medicine, what Catlin called the greatest secret of life. The secret was breathing. The Native Americans explained to Catlin that breath inhaled through the mouth sapped the body of strength, deformed the face, and caused stress and disease. On the other hand, breath inhaled through the nose kept the body strong, made the face beautiful, and prevented disease. The air which enters the lungs is as different from that which enters the nostrils as distilled water is different from water in an ordinary cistern or a frog pond, he wrote. Healthy nasal breathing started at birth. Mothers in all these tribes followed the same practices, carefully closing the baby's lips with their fingers after each feeding. At night, they'd stand over sleeping infants and gently pinch mouths shut if they opened. Some Plains tribes strapped infants to a straight board and placed a pillow beneath their heads, creating a posture that made it much harder to breathe through the mouth. During winter, infants would be wrapped in light clothing and then held at arm's length on warmer days so they'd be less prone to get too hot and begin panting. All these methods trained children to breathe through their noses all day, every day. It was a habit they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Catlin described how adult tribal members would even resist smiling with an open mouth, fearing some noxious air might get in. This practice was as old and unchangeable as the hills, he wrote, and it was shared universally throughout the tribes for millennia. The Europeans who came here were weak, were prone to get sick, had incredibly crooked teeth, and breathe through their mouths. In the book Catlin wrote, Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life, he detailed, and I've read this book, he details how the health of indigenous peoples is so the opposite of the health of European nations and European peoples. And I read this not to create this image of this place with some nirvana before Europeans got here and they just destroyed everything. But I wanted to give you an understanding of what health looked like here. Right? Over the last several hundred years, yes, our lives have gotten much longer. That is primarily due to like vaccines and sanitation. And as we've gotten better at keeping ourselves clean and at killing diseases through vaccinations, we've been dying of chronic diseases, whether it's diabetes or cancers or other health problems related to obesity. And our health has been deteriorating progressively. And this was happening 200 years ago. It was already visible in the European lives and in the European culture as compared to the indigenous cultures. When you read some of the books that I talk about, they literally talk about wherever Western culture and the Western diet and the Western lifestyle goes, the chronic diseases of the people skyrocket. And it just goes through the roof, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in other jungle nations and places that have been untouched so far by Western culture. And as the food and the lifestyle goes, it has this massive impact. And so I wanted just to paint this picture for you of what the health of our native peoples looked like prior to colonization. Okay? Now I want to talk to you for a few minutes about colonization. Columbus, Lewis and Clark, the doctrine of discovery, and manifest destiny. So for those of you who are not aware, the doctrine of discovery, it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that the European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. It's the same doctrine that allowed Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in what they called this new world and claimed to have discovered it. Right? The first sentence of the first chapter of this book says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands, but you can't discover them unless your worldview and your church informs you that the people living there are not human. Right? You cannot discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your car keys out, leave your laptops out. I will be happy to come by. There's a few more native peoples. We'll come by and discover them for you. Right? Clearly, this isn't discovery, it's stealing. And so the doctrine of discovery is we go into it much more clearly. In chapters 3 and 4 of this book, we talk about how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, to a doctrine that said you can kill people who don't look like, act like, worship like, or eat like you. That journey is fascinating. I don't have time to go into it right now. But what we conclude is the doctrine of discovery is the white Christian male supremacist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now, the challenge with this doctrine is what we've done with it as a nation. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains and says to the colonists that are here that they do not have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they go on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. Making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used that inclusive term all men is because their definition of who was human was very, very, very narrow. So this makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically racist and sexist document, right? They said men, not women. They called natives savages. A few years later, the founders wrote another document. They began this one with the words, "We the people of the United States." Again, this is the preamble to the Constitution. If you read just a few lines later, not even much further, Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 is the part of the Constitution that refers to who is and who is not a part of this union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. If you read Article 1, Section 2, you have to note, first of all, it never mentions women. That's important because if you read the entire document, preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So we have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? 1787, you take away women, you take away natives, you take away African people, who's left? White men, right? And technically, you had to be a landowner to vote. So we don't talk about this enough, but the purpose of the Constitution, the reason it was written, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. In 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. This is Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent, and they're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one bought the same land from the government, and they want to know who owned it. Case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the John Marshall Court, considered one of the greatest jurists in Supreme Court history. They had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. They ruled it was discovery that gave title to the land. Then, because that might possibly imply natives had some sovereignty over our lands, they went on to clarify and said, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country would be to leave the country a wilderness. This case, along with a few others in the 1820s and 30s, create the legal precedent for land titles. This precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court by name in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. My TEDx talk talks about some of these court cases. I want to talk for a moment just about the 2005 one. In the 1700s, the Oneida Indian Nation occupied about 6 million acres in central state New York. George Washington's administration reduced that down to a few 100,000 acres, and then he passed a law that said only the federal government could purchase lands from the Oneida. The state of New York continued to illegally purchase lands from the Oneida until all their lands were bought up and they shipped them out to Oklahoma. In the 1990s, the Oneida Indian Nation came back into New York and they bought some of their personal lands, their tribal lands on the open market. They paid full price for them, and they wanted to reestablish their sovereignty over them. The lands they bought were within the city limits of the city of Sherrill. The city of Sherrill wanted their tax revenue, but the Oneidas weren't paying taxes because they said they were sovereign over the land. And so they sued them in the federal district court. The Oneida Indians won that case in federal court, so the city of Sherrill appealed to the Court of Appeals. That decision was upheld, so they appealed a second time to the Supreme Court, 2004. The Supreme Court reversed the decision of the lower court. In the first footnote of the case, where they're establishing precedent, they reference by name the doctrine of discovery. They go on to state that given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, and the regulatory authority constantly exercised by New York State and its counties and towns, and the United's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They then go on to state that they reference another case and say it's impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement, which was white settlement, and a large portion of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. They then go on to say, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneidas sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the Oneidas sought to regain ancient sovereignty over lands converted from wilderness to become parts of cities like Sherrill. Now, if this argument sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's the same argument that John Marshall used in 1823. Doesn't use the word savages, but basically it says these lands were uncivilized, we civilized them, and now we own them. So the Supreme Court 2005 concludes that we reject the unification theory of the lower courts and the Oneida Indian Nation, and we hold that the standards of federal Indian law, again, footnote 1, doctrine of discovery, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. and it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. This shocks people, because her legacy is that she was a voice of dissent on a very conservative Supreme Court. She was fighting for the rights of the marginalized, which she was and which she did. But because to this day, land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value, which Justice Ginsburg demonstrated in 2005 very clearly. I want to go back a few years to 1630. In 1630, John Winthrop, Protestant pastor, was on board a ship. He was in what's now called the Boston Harbor with a group of people to plant the Boston colony. On board his ship, he preached a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he referred to the colonists he was with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations. End of the sermon, he does what many Protestant pastors do, which is to compel his congregants to heed his exhortations. He quotes from the threats and promises of the Old Testament. John Winthrop decides to read from Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of the land covenant. If you do this, if you obey me, I'll do this for you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. End of this passage, it says, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes the word river to vast sea. Now, why does he do this? Well, they didn't cross a river, they crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the exhortations of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel, they are standing on the banks of their shores of their promised land, ready to go and take possession of them. I refer to this sermon as the birth of American exceptionalism, the myth of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism isn't just about Americans are better at things than other people. American exceptionalism says we have a unique relationship with the divine. We have a covenant with the God of Abraham. So this idea percolates. This is the 1630s. That idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s. Oh, and I forgot. This is perfectly in line with Promised Land theology. Right? In Deuteronomy 20, God tells the people of Israel, moreover, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving us inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you. So promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another group of people. Again, that idea percolates. 100 years. Mid-1700s, we start going westward. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's a growth in churches, a renewal within denominations. Early 1840s, this nation proclaims a self-declared manifest destiny. The belief that they, white Europeans, have the God-given right to rule this continent from sea to shining sea. Now, the manifest destiny is not the end of the era of discovery. In fact, it's just the beginning of the second chapter of discovery, one that you're much more familiar with as people in the Pacific Northwest. Lewis and Clark led the core of discovery as they went west of the Mississippi River to try and find a passageway all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Just a few days before they left on their expedition, Thomas Jefferson completed negotiations for the Louisiana Purchase, which was purchasing all of the lands west of the Mississippi River, the whole Mississippi River watershed. We were buying it from France. Prior to that purchase, Lewis and Clark were going into foreign territory. They were going into Spanish and French territory. And they were very well aware of that. And the message they were bringing to the native nations west of the Mississippi was, we, the Americans, will be better partners with you. We will be better trade partners. We will be better military partners. We will have better alliances with you. You will benefit from being our partner in these national interests. After the Louisiana Purchase, which happened just before they left on their expedition, Thomas Jefferson changed the message he wanted them to bring to the native nations west of the Mississippi. Their new message after the purchase was, you have a new great white father, and you will do well to listen to him, lest he might destroy you. And that's the message Lewis and Clark brought to the nations west of the Mississippi River. When you read the expeditions of Lewis and Clark, especially as a native person, and when you know the ending, it's rough. Because multiple times throughout their expedition, Lewis and Clark are on the verge of dying. They don't know where to winter. They don't know what food to eat. They don't know the passes to take. They don't know how to survive in the plains and in the Rocky Mountains. And time again, they're literally on the verge of death and just dying in the middle of their expedition. And time again, they meet a native nation, and those native nations help them. The Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Sioux, the Yakima, the Mandan. Many of these nations help them. And it's heartbreaking because almost all of these nations end up being massacred, ethnically cleansed, removed, or obliterated by the U.S. government just a few decades later. Lewis and Clark just began the breaking of the dam. And it all happened because of the discovery of gold. Literally at different points in one of the books I was reading about Lewis and Clark, they said any number of times one of these nations could have destroyed Lewis and Clark's little core of discovery, commandeered their weapons, and become the new military force of that region. And none of them did. They all helped Lewis and Clark. Many times, all to their own ultimate demise, or at least to their own detriment. So we have a lot of buried history. We have the California Gold Rush, the Colorado Gold Rush in the 40s and 50s. We have gold discovered in places like Idaho. And then we start getting the massacres with the Bear River Massacre. We have the Nez Perce War. We have the massacre at Wounded Knee. We have the Black Hills Gold Rush. And we just have all these, and this is manifest destiny. This is what it looks like. I want to talk for a few minutes about this man. This man occupies 2 chapters in Unsettling Truths, the 2 hardest chapters to read. Chapters 9 and 10. We look at the adage in chapters 9 and 10 of The Victors Write the History, which no one disagrees with, right? You win a war, you get to write about the war. But we point out that the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. Technically, the Korean War is not over. We pulled out of Afghanistan, we pulled out of Vietnam, but we didn't lose any land. We didn't get defeated there. We've never been disarmed. We've never had a regime change. We've won every major military conflict we've been a part of. We speculated in these chapters what would happen if Nazi Germany won World War II, right? how would their historians have recorded the legacy of Hitler? He'd probably be their greatest leader ever, right, if they got to write that history. If Nazi Germany had won World War II, how would they have recorded about the Holocaust? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war, right? What Holocaust? There wasn't a Holocaust. What makes 9 and 10 so hard to read is we take that understanding and we apply it to Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 9, and I don't have time to go into this right now, demonstrates very clearly how Abraham Lincoln was, until he died, a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist. Chapters 10, we look at his Indian policies. In 1862, he signed two laws, the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. The Pacific Railway Act, or the Homestead Act gave 160 acres to anyone going west to Homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act allocated the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. I don't have time to go into everything Abraham Lincoln did after this because I want to talk about some health issues. So I'm going to talk primarily for a moment about my own people, the Navajo people. In the fall of 1863, just a little over a year after he signed those two bills, Abraham's general, General Carleton in the Southwest, gave this order. He said, "Henceforth every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the bush Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move." There will be no more talk on this subject. So Army captains like Kit Carson go through our lands. They burn our crops. They burn our hogans. They butcher and destroy our cattle and our livestock. And they hunt our people, rounding us up to bring us down to Bosque Redondo. In the book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke, he writes, "By the middle of December, most of the weak and aged had died. There's hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather or a pregnant mother that had to be left behind. When the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol or taken captive by slave raiders." They rounded up nearly 10,000 of my Navajo people. They marched us down to Bosque Redondo in southeast New Mexico. Hundreds of my people died of exposure and starvation along the way. At the camp, D. Brown, in the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, wrote, "It was a wretched place," they said. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets. To shelter themselves, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground and cover them with linen, with mats of woven grass. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. It was a bad place, and although escape was difficult, many tried to get away, risking their own lives. They called this a reservation, but it's very clear what it was. It was a death camp. It was a death camp that took the lives of a quarter of my people. 2,300 Navajo people died in this death camp. And it was a death camp that was approved by none other than Abraham Lincoln in 1864. In the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This allocated the land and the resources to complete the railway. It also gave the mineral rights to the railway companies to financially incentivize them to build even faster. All in all, over the period after the signing of those bills, after the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the removal of the Dakota Winnebago from Minnesota, after the Bear River Massacre of the Shoshone in northern Utah and southern Idaho, the Long Walk of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache from the Southwest, and the last one on November 29 of 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Abraham Lincoln, 8 days after the Sand Creek Massacre, 8 days later, he was giving a speech, his State of the Union address, his annual address, and this is what he said. He said, 1.5 million acres have been entered in under the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives us assurance of success. He was absolutely confident 8 days after the Sand Creek Massacre that they were going to complete Manifest Destiny. Why? Well, this is a map of the early transcontinental railway lines. We had reached Omaha, Nebraska. We had to go through Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and come out near San Francisco for the central route. We had the northern route going from Duluth, Minnesota, through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and come out near Seattle. And we had a southern route going through the territory of New Mexico, Arizona, coming out near Los Angeles. After the removal of the Winnebago and the Dakota from Minnesota, of the Shoshone from northern Utah and southern Idaho, of the Navajo from the southwest, and finally of the Cheyenne and Arapaho from eastern Colorado, you can see Abraham Lincoln was just ethnically cleansing the northern, central, and southern routes of the railway. See, not only was Abraham Lincoln a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist, but he was actually one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. At the end of chapter 10, I directly compare Lincoln to Hitler. Because that's what he was doing. And that's what happens when the victors get to write their history, is they take war criminals and despots and make them heroes. And just so you know, he wasn't acting entirely alone. This is a list of many of the massacres our country did in the entire century of the 1800s. In the middle of that century, in 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the governor of California, this is right after the California Gold Rush, he said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop its spread, nor is he saying famine has hit and we can't feed them. He's saying we can't stop killing these people until they're gone. And this, of course, is perfectly in line with Promised Land theology. Remember where in Deuteronomy it said, leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive, completely destroy them. Which is what this nation was doing. In my normal lecture, I would go on to talk about some other things, but I want to wrap this discussion around health. Because I want to talk about what colonization has done to our health. Not just the health of Native peoples, but the health of this entire nation. So we have to understand this. If you get the QR code that was at the beginning and the end of this presentation, there's a report on the list of links I gave in that QR code. This is the legal and historical roots of health care for American Indians and Alaska Natives in the United States. And this report, it's a good report. I encourage you to read it. It goes over many of the same points I just went through about the history of this country. But it frames it within the larger context of healthcare and how that has impacted healthcare of American Indians. And you can see on this chart, right, we have the full tribal sovereignty before 1492. Then we have, they call it the policy of conquest, which went up to the point of the Constitution. The 1800s, they call that the period of treaty making. This is where we see the first congressional appropriation for health care after the smallpox vaccine, which they were actually putting in blankets they were giving to us. not the vaccine, but the smallpox. And then we see in 1849, the transfer of Indian healthcare services gets transferred away from the War Department. In 1867, we have the acquisition of Alaska. Then we go in through a period of the late 1800s of assimilation. Important one in around 1870 is traditional healthcare practices are banned. So these are ceremonies, dances, things that we as Native peoples did for our own health and to secure our own health. Those practices are outlawed. Then we have the Allotment Act in 1887, which results in taking the land of our people. We have reorganization in the early 1900s with the Reorganization Act, the Snyder Act, and then we have tribes being terminated during the termination period in the mid-1900s, and then we have a period of self-determination which happens in the later 1900s. Again, I encourage you, you can read this report online. It's not that long, but it puts things in the context of healthcare. Diabetes in our Native communities is rampant. Some places it's over 50%. Alaskan Natives, this is adults age 18 and over diagnosed with diabetes in 2023, 13.2. Non-Hispanic whites was 8.9. We're 1.5 times greater in diabetes. When you look at the rate of death and mortality, this is the adjusted rate per 100,000 people. You can see American Indians is massively higher, 1.4 to 1.5 times the rate of white people. And white people aren't low, just so you don't think that their health is great. White people are dying at very high rates of diabetes as well. The incidence of end-stage renal disease due to diabetes, you can see, is astronomically higher for American Indians and and Native Alaskans compared to white people, 2.4 times greater. My nation, the Navajo Nation, it's the largest reservation in the country. It's 26,000 square miles. If we were a state, we'd be the 40th largest state. We also have the highest population of Native peoples. We have 300,000 enrolled tribal members. About 2/3 of them, 180 to 200,000, live on the reservation. The reservation is one of the worst food deserts in the country. 26,000 square miles, 200,000 people. We have 13 grocery stores. And this is data from like a year ago. When I lived there 10 years ago, it was about 12. When I moved back to the Navajo Nation in the early 2000s, I was the pastor of a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And I moved back to the reservation with my family because I wanted to lead within our Native communities. And I realized because I was raised in a border town, my grandparents were boarding school survivors. And that meant they did not teach the language to my father, so he didn't know what to teach it to me. So I didn't know my language, I didn't know my culture, I didn't know the traditions. And if I wanted to lead within my community, I knew I had to live on the reservation and be in the context of that. So we moved from Denver, Colorado, back to the Navajo Nation. For 3 years, the first 3 years, we lived in a remote section of our reservation. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We lived in a one-room hogan, about 20 feet in diameter, had a dirt floor and log walls. We were on a sheep camp. Our neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. There was no running water. There was no electricity. We had an outhouse about 50 yards away that we used. We had to haul our water. We had to cook by a camp stove or over an open fire. We prepared ourselves to live off the grid. But what took us by surprise was how isolated we felt. Learned very quickly the only non-natives we ever saw on the reservation were those who came to take our picture or those who came to give us charity. No one ever came back, and no one was interested in building relationships. It was there that I wrote this metaphor that was referred to at the beginning of this people would ask me, how does it feel to be native and living on the reservation? And every time I tried to have that conversation, I would become very angry. I was learning about the doctrine of discovery. I was seeing the historical trauma of my people. I was experiencing living in this place, not only where there was all of these trauma-related things, but health was so horrible. We were in a food desert in the middle of this country. And I never knew how to talk about this to my friends. They'd ask, how does it feel? And I would feel this anger welling up in me, and I'd have to hang up the phone to not yell at them. So I started talking about it in the third person, like I read it in the newspaper, and I could then engage with it longer. But the more I engaged, then the more they would get defensive. Well, I didn't do that. My family, my church didn't do that. That's not what we were a part of. And soon they would hang up the phone. And I didn't know how to have a conversation. And so I said one day, I was writing a letter, it was like the 10th time trying to get them to understand how it felt. I said, being Native American and living in the United States, it feels like our Native peoples are this old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they violently locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture. They're eating our food. They're having a party inside our house. They've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to the bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and just simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I wrote that, that's it. That's how I feel. I've used that metaphor now around the globe to initiate dialogue between indigenous peoples and their colonizers. But that dialogue is just the beginning. The thank you is not a conversation. And the thank you doesn't even fix anything. All the thank you does is it shifts the paradigm. Because you can't say thank you without recognizing that the house is not yours. And that's the whole point, is to have a dialogue where we can begin to change the paradigm of the entire conversation. And so this is how I want to begin talking about framing the discussion around health, by talking about the difference between indigenous wisdom and scientific data. So for my personal journey to decolonize my health, it started with acknowledging and recognizing not only the agency, but the wisdom of my elders and of my people. I began blogging when we moved into that Hogan. My blog was called Reflections from the Hogan. And if you go back, it's still online. You can see how my journey has progressed over this was 20 years ago, almost over 20 years ago we moved back to the Hogan. And you can see how I've been wrestling with things about Native culture, about growing up in a Western culture. And you can see the wrestling that I do as I look at the distinction between the wisdom and the lifestyle and the practices on the reservation, and then the way that our country operates in other ways. One way is I talk about how you get used to giving up control. So much of Western culture is about being in control, right? We try to control everything. And a lot of that comes from our time perception. Western culture has a linear time perception, has a definite starting point and a definite ending point. As you move across the timeline, right, you have a timeline. As you move across it, you pass events. Once you pass an event, it's gone. You're not allowed to go back. So this creates an anxiety in people who live in a linear perception of time, right? So to compensate for that anxiety, they make a schedule, and that's how they live their lives, according to a schedule. You have lunch here, dinner here, go to bed here, right? You have a schedule for your life, right? You graduate high school here, college here, start your career here, retire at this point. You have a schedule. You honor people and show value by honoring the schedule, right? So you honor your elders by showing up on time. You honor your professor or your pastor by getting to church on time, right? God honors you by letting you out before the football game starts, right? I mean, this is the way the time perception works. So what's a midlife crisis? Well, you get most of the way through your life, you haven't accomplished your goals, you can't go back, so you buy a Porsche, right? So you look like you've accomplished some of your goals. The native time perception, I can only speak with authority about the novel time perception, is different. It's circular. There's no definite beginning, no definite ending point. As you go around the circle, you still pass events, but if you miss something, you don't worry about it. How come? It's going to come back around again. So the way we organize our life is not by keeping a schedule, but by completing a task. So you don't work on something until the bell rings, you work on something until you finish it. So I could have plans to have lunch with an elder at noon on our reservation. I could show up at 1. I don't owe them an apology. I have not offended them yet. But if I sit down, I look at my watch and say, I have to go in 10 minutes. That's offensive, because I'm not letting the conversation come to a natural conclusion. Just a totally different way. And I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong, one's good, one's bad. They're different. The challenge is most of us don't think we have a time perception. We think we have a time truth. And white people think they have a superior time truth. And so we judge people based on what we understand the truth of time to be. And so one of the challenges with a linear perception of time is it gives you the illusion that you're in control. And you're not. But you can maintain that illusion. Why do you think weather freaks out white people so bad? Right? It's one of the few things they can't control. Everything else, you either control it or you can buy insurance for it, right? And that comes from the Western linear perception of time. It gives you the illusion you can control things. Remember the tsunami that hit in early 2000s, right? I remember seeing pictures of resorts along the water with Western people there. And as the water got sucked out into the wave, the people at the beach got excited and began going out further into the water. Literally to be just killed. I went to Sri Lanka a few months after the tsunami, and I met with some of the people there, and I was taken to this one village that was completely wiped out. We were a mile or so from the shore, and buildings were flat. You could see the shore clearly. They said before the tsunami, you couldn't see anything from here because of all the huts and the buildings here. Completely wiped out. I asked with fear and trepidation, how many people died in this village? They said, oh, none. I said, why? They said, well, because the elders were sitting out that morning, and they saw the birds and the animals leaving the shore. And they said to their village, something's not right. We have to go inland. Right? This is about control. White people love to build their houses on cliffs and then claim they're a victim when a mudslide happens or a wave comes. Right? Whereas native peoples were like, you don't build it on the cliff. What are you thinking? It's about control. And a lot of that comes from the perception of time. I began really wrestling with a lot of these things when I was living, and you can see my wrestling in some of the blog posts that I wrote. I'm wrestling with the difference between scientific data and indigenous wisdom. If you've ever read the book Braiding Sweetgrass, I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Robin is a botanist who was raised traditionally, more traditionally at least. And she has one part of this where she grew up with the understanding from her elders that the trees talk to them. And as she applied for school and told people why she wanted to be a botanist, and some of that worldview came out, she was mocked, she was ridiculed. And she writes in one part of her book, she says, but today, scientists are catching up with my elders because they're learning that trees do communicate with each other through their root system, through pheromones. They can alert other trees to danger that's coming. They do communicate. Scientific data is catching up with indigenous wisdom. Fascinating worldview and paradigm shift she has in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. I highly recommend it. If you ever Googled the word nature, the definition of nature, I'm going to read it for you. The definition says, the phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. Think about that for a minute. What did that just say? How does Western culture define itself in regards to nature? It's separate from it, right? You have the natural world, which is separate or opposed to humans and human creation. And we can see this. We can see this, right? Republicans want to exploit the environment. I remember talking with someone who's telling me about his father. I forget which nation he was from. His father was an elder in their nation. And someone asked him, what do you think about all these undocumented immigrants from Europe living in your country? And he said, they'll leave. What do you mean they'll leave? They've been here for hundreds of years. Yeah, but when the resources are gone and they've exploited it, they'll leave. And then we'll nurse our land back to health. And what are the billionaires doing right now? Space race. Building bunkers, getting ready to leave. So one side wants to exploit nature. The other side thinks you have to preserve it. There's this documentary called Homelands about native nations trying to reclaim sovereignty or understand sovereignty of their own land. And they look at the Athabascan people who live along the migratory route of the caribou. And the Athabascan creation story tells them that there's a piece of the Athabascan heart in the caribou and the piece of the caribou heart in the Athabascan. They have a mutually beneficial relationship. And he said when the caribou go north in the spring to calf, we never hunt them. Doesn't matter if we're in famine, if people are starving, we never hunt the caribou when they go north. And they said, environmentalists love us because thank you for caring for the caribou. Thank you for your respect for nature, blah, 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 blah. He said, but then they're shocked and appalled at us when we hunt them when they go south. How can you hunt the caribou? We need them. We need their furs to keep us warm. We need their meat to nourish us. We don't exploit them, but we need them. People on the left somehow think they're not a part of the food chain. And they can just take their vitamin supplements and drink their smoothies, and they're going to be fine. And that's not true. Both sides, Western culture defined nature as separate from humans. It's not a partisan problem. It's not a left or a right problem. It's part of that worldview that says we are separate from nature. And we can either use it until it's gone, or we can somehow exist without it to preserve it like a museum. And neither one of those are accurate. In the book Breath by James Nestor, this is one of the later books I read. It's a fascinating book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Again, James oversells breath, but he has some really good points. It was actually his book I was quoting from you earlier when I read about George Catlin. And he goes on he's a journalist who goes on kind of a journey to understand why he has such horrible chronic breathing problems his entire life. And in his book, he quotes this guy, Ernest Houghton. It says, "Since we have known for a long time that savages have excellent teeth and civilized men have terrible teeth, it seems to me that we have been extraordinarily stupid in concentrating all of our attention upon the task of finding out why our teeth are so poor without ever bothering to learn why the savages' teeth are so good." You see, this is the problem with discovery. When you think you discover something, it's not just that the lands are empty and no one's here, it's that the people who are here aren't people. And they have nothing to teach us. We have nothing to learn from them. We have nothing to benefit from them. As he goes through his entire journey on breath, and to be honest, I read this book last in part because I didn't think it would apply. I'm like, how can you get breathing wrong? Wouldn't you die if you got that wrong? But when I read it, it transformed my paradigm about the benefits of nose breathing versus mouth breathing. He actually did a 20-day study that he was a part of at Stanford. Diet and exercise were controlled. There were 2 participants in the study. For the first 10 days, they taped their noses shut and breathed only through their mouths. For the second 10 days, they taped their mouths shut and breathed only through their noses. When they breathed through their mouths, their blood pressure went up, they began snoring, they started showing signs of sleep apnea, and they got more nervous or more agitated. After 10 days. After 10 days of breathing through their nose instead of their mouth, their blood pressure went down, they stopped snoring, their symptoms of sleep apnea went away, and they were much more calm. When you breathe through your nose warms the air and it filters it before it gets to your lungs. When you breathe through your mouth, you're sucking in cold, unfiltered air directly into your lungs. The reason, I want to read this for you. This is what he wrote. 95% of the modern processed diet was soft. Even what's considered healthy food today, smoothies, nut butters, oatmeal, avocados, wheat bread, vegetable soups, and on, it's all soft. Our ancient ancestors chewed for hours a day, every day, and because they chewed so much, their mouths, teeth, throat, and face grew to be wide and strong and pronounced. Food in industrialized societies was so processed that it hardly required any chewing at all. And that's why so many of the skulls I examined in the Paris ossuary had narrow faces and crooked teeth. It's why so many of us snore today, and why our noses are stuffed and our airways are clogged. Why we need sprays, pills, or surgical drilling just to get a breath of fresh air. The reason native peoples had perfectly straight teeth and breathed through our noses, and the reason Europeans had crooked teeth and they breathed through their mouths, is because they were eating processed foods and weren't chewing it very much, and we were eating whole foods and chewing it a lot. When they went back to the ossuaries and they looked at how hundreds of years of dead bodies and skulls and bones, and they looked at as industrialized or as processed food was introduced and people began chewing less, their mouths got smaller, their teeth got more crooked, their nasal passages and their sinuses shrunk, and their health deteriorated. This is why your vitamin-enriched smoothie is not going to save your life. We need to chew our food. We need to bite into an apple. We need to crunch in a carrot. We need to gnaw on a celery. We need to chew our food. When we don't chew our food, it has a massively negative impact on our health. Katie Bowman, the woman I was talking about earlier, the biomechanist, this is one of the books she wrote. It's called Movement Matters. Katie Bowman, again, her book, Move Your DNA, was a paradigm shift for me. And this book blew me away. This book was one of her first books, I think. It's a bit more raw than her Move Your DNA book. And in this book, she looks at the challenges of science. And she looks at how science is reductionary, right? So if you want to be a doctor, you study biology as an undergrad. Then as you get into your upper division classes, you start looking at human anatomy. As you get into med school, you start specializing on a certain part of the body. Eventually, you narrow down to an organ or an area of the body. And then you get down to a really small, and you become the specialist in this one thing, right? This one small little part of the body. It's reductionary. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's the way it is. And so you become the pancreas guy or the spleen person or whatever it is else that you're specializing in. That's your area of expertise, and that's the way science works. And Katie Bowman studies not health, but movement. She's a biomechanist. And she was talking about this, and this is what she wrote. She said, I would suggest that a group of humans has never been this sedentary and survived. We have no idea how to move, and so we are turning to science to show us. P.S., that's not science's role at all. But when you have an elder-free society, you have to turn somewhere. And scientific data is where many of us are turning. When you have an elder-free society, think about that for a moment. When you have a doctrine of discovery that tells you these lands are empty, when you view the people living here as savages who have nothing to teach you, as we've already read numerous times, you don't bother to ask them why they're so healthy. What do they know? They're savages. They don't have science. They don't have microscopes. They don't have modern medicines. What do they know? Science is about reducing things down to understand the components. And I'm not saying that's bad. That can be very, very, very beneficial. But that is not how you learn about health. Why? Because health is not about how one organ works. Health is not you need vitamin C and vitamin A. Health is you have to peel and chew an orange. And you have to go outside to get your vitamin D. It's not about supplements, it's about the whole. And that's where indigenous wisdom comes in. We don't know the science. Our elders didn't understand the science about how insulin works, or they understand the science about how other things happened. But we knew from observing for tens of thousands of years the impact eating certain foods and living in certain ways and doing certain movements had on our overall health. And that's the problem with our modern medicine is you can talk to a ton of specialists, but no one's synthesizing all the information. No one's bringing these little components back to the big picture. So if you talk to your specialist in this about your health and the specialist in that about, you're going to get two different diagnoses and conclusions of what you need to do because no one understands the whole. And so as I was sifting through all these books, right, and they're all filled with toxic positivity, they're all filled with if you do this one thing, all you have to do is breathe, all you have to do is give up seed oils, all you have to do is do this, right? They found their one specialty thing and they wrote this book to tell you about what it is. And you need a filter. You need some way to how do I make sense of all this? And I realize my filter are my ancestors. How did they live? What did they do? How did they move? How did they teach? And I realized when I read these books with that filter, I was able to find the piece of benefit from each of the books. And I was able to construct them almost like a puzzle into a much better picture of health. I want to talk to you for a few minutes before we end here about what I did, how I changed my health in the past year and a half. The decisions I made, why I made them, and the benefit it had for me. I told you that first book I read, 5 a.m. Club, Toxic Positivity, I don't recommend it at all. But I gained something really valuable from there, which is waking up and sweating first thing in the morning. When I moved to the reservation 20 years ago, I took up the practice of watching the sunrise. By far, one of the most transformative experiences of my spiritual disciplines I've ever done. Absolutely transformed my relationship with Creator. But I didn't do it correctly. Because you're supposed to wake up and run, and some would say run screaming to the east to watch the sunrise. And I didn't run. I got up and walked outside my door and watched it from my house. I decided a year ago I was going to start sweating in the morning. Now, when you drive in D.C., your horn is an extension of your voice box. If anyone waits more than half a second at a light, you're laying on the horn. If anyone even thinks about turning in front of you, you're laying on your horn. And I will acknowledge I participated freely in this community. And it's stressful. And I started breaking a sweat in the morning. And a couple days later, I was driving my daughter to school and someone cut us off, and I didn't honk. And my daughter looked at me like, "Dad, what's wrong?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "I'm annoyed by them. But if I honk, I'm going to get stressed out. They're clearly having a bad day. It's not going to help them at all." I said, "I still get irritated by them, but I have more impulse control." Getting up in the morning and sweating gave me greater impulse control. And I immediately lamented I hadn't been running and sweating in the morning for 20 years. Who knows what I've learned over the past 20 years? If just watching the sunrise taught me that much, what if I'd actually listened to my elders and ran to the sunrise? So now I try to wake up on a regular basis and sweat as many times a week as I can in the morning. Sometimes I run, sometimes I erg, sometimes I do elliptical, but I wake up and I sweat and do something, and I frequently will run to watch the sunrise. I also began doing barefoot running. Why? Because when my people ran to the sunrise, they probably ran barefoot or in moccasins. When I researched barefoot running, most of our shoes, and these are barefoot shoes, they're zero-rise shoes, so they're completely fat. Most of us have shoes that have heels on it. You can thank Nike for that when they got the whole running, jogging craze started. And most of our heels lift us up. When your heels are lifted up, you're leaning forward. So to correct for that, you have to arch your back a little bit to stand straight. Otherwise, you would fall forward. Many people in America have chronic back pain. Why? Because we're constantly lifting up our heels, arching our back, and straining these muscles. Now, many of us get injured when we start running barefoot. Why? Because when you are on shoes that raise your heels, because when you sit and you sit this way for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, your calf muscle is permanently or is constantly being contracted, and your Achilles tendon is constantly shortened, almost permanently. So when you start walking barefoot and then running, you have to stretch out your calf muscle and stretch out your tendon, and that can take anywhere from 4 months to a year. If you just went out and running barefoot tomorrow, it would feel great. But then 2 days later, you would be in a lot of pain because your tendon and your muscles aren't used to doing that kind of movement. When I began running barefoot, I actually ran barefoot in our neighborhood. In DC, we get more rain than you get here in Seattle. But our rain is different. It doesn't come in drizzles over a long period of time. We get thunderstorms in and out, and it rains for a few hours, and it clears up, and then we'll get more. And if we go more than 10 days, it's like people say we're in a drought. I'm from the Southwest. That's not what a drought is. But that's what they say. After 10 days, like it's a drought. When I began walking barefoot every day, there was one period last summer where we went almost 2 months without rain. And you could really tell in DC. Things start getting dry, start looking like the Southwest. And I would walk over the same grass every morning, barefoot. And I could feel it getting pricklier and pricklier every day. And I'd been in DC for 10 years at that point. And I will tell you, that is the most connected I've ever felt to the ground in that land in my entire decade of living there. I could feel how parched the ground was and how hungry it was for rain. And I felt so unbelievably connected to the ground just being able to walk on it that way. After reading Katie Bowman's book on movement, Move Your DNA, I decided I was going to start moving more again. I took a week off of work and began thinking about it, not just exercising, but moving. Your average hunter-gatherer walks between 6 and 12 miles a day. They did a doubly labeled DNA, or a doubly labeled water test on the Hazda people. Doubly labeled water is the gold standard of energy burn. It will tell you exactly how many calories you burn, and your watch is lying to you. You can estimate fairly accurately how many calories you're taking in. You have a very difficult time estimating how many calories you're burning. Why? Because your body has been evolving for hundreds, millions of years, and it has gotten very good at keeping you alive during periods of incredible food insecurity. And because most of us exercise in blocks at the beginning or end of the day, right? So you wake up and you run your mile before you go to work, or you do it in the evening before you go to bed. Your body throughout the rest of the day is going to conserve energy. So if you went running, both consciously and subconsciously, the rest of the day, you'll probably take the elevator instead of the stairs. You'll probably sit instead of stand. If nothing else, your body will lower your metabolism. When they did a doubly labeled water test looking at the calorie burn of the Hazda people and couch potatoes from the Midwest, they found a 300 calorie difference. That's it. That's 2 slices of bread. Why? Because the body is really, it's not a machine. It's a finely tuned living organism that is working incredibly hard to keep you alive in the midst of food insecurity, which we don't experience much now, but we did absolutely throughout the time frame. And so if you're losing more than a half a pound a week, you're doing something that's not sustainable. You're either starving yourself too much or you're exercising beyond what you can endure. Two to 300 calories is literally the difference between the Hazda and the Midwestern couch potato. Walking 3,000 steps a day, walking 20 to 25,000 steps a day. 300 calories is the difference. And so what I've begun doing in my life over this past year is I began moving more. Not exercising, moving more. I made my life walkable. My office is a mile away. I walk there and back twice a day. I have a grocery store on the way to my office. I stop there and I buy fruits and vegetables for the day, for the next 24 hours at that store, forcing me to go back tomorrow. I'm a hunter-gatherer. I don't hunt animals and gather roots, but I read labels. Do you know how hard it took me, how much hunting and gathering I had to do to find ice cream that's not highly processed? I buy ice cream that has 4 ingredients: cream, milk, vanilla beans or cocoa beans, and sugar. I had to do a lot of hunting and gathering to find that. I love ice cream. When we were hunters and gatherers, all of us, at some point in our people's history, you have a relationship between movement and food. You move to hunt, to gather, and your reward is you eat. We've reversed that today. We can get food by pressing a button on our phone and having it delivered to us. Right? And then we often overeat because of that. So we punish ourselves by making ourselves exercise. We've reversed the relationship between movement and food. And we need to correct that. That's one of the reasons why I walk to the grocery store every day, because it forces me to go there I buy 3 bananas. I buy 1 tomato and 1 onion. I buy what I need for the next 24 hours, so I will have to go back tomorrow and walk more to get there, to reinforce this relationship between my movement and my food. I began cooking at home a whole lot more. I have young kids. They love pizza, they love hamburgers, they love all that kind of stuff. So my challenge to myself was, I'm going to learn how to cook the foods they love better than the restaurants they get them from. When I made a better pizza than the local pizzeria, when I made a better hamburger than the local hamburger place, I was like, I won. I won, right? Now they want my food at home instead of what they can buy out. I began buying more whole foods that we have to chew. And not just lean meat. There's a huge debate between lean versus fat and how much are we supposed to eat and blah, blah, blah. As Navajo people, we've been sheep herders for 100 years and hunters for even hundreds or thousands of years. And when you kill something, when you ask something to give up its life to nourish you, you don't waste any of it. You eat everything. The fat, the intestines, the gizzards, the chi, which is the intestines for us. You eat everything. And so I began eating, much less concerned about fat versus lean, and eating the whole what's available, out of respect for the animal that gave its life so that I could be nourished. Time-restricted eating was one of the biggest changes I made, one of the bigger changes I made. Some people talk about intermittent fasting. Time-restricted eating is a bit different. Intermittent fasting is kind of sporadic. You'll change it on a weekly or a monthly basis. Time-restricted eating is just your standard for eating. So I have a window when I eat. I eat no calories after 7 p.m. and no calories before 9 a.m. So I have a 14-hour window where my body is fasting. The challenge we have as a nation is we have an abundance of food, and we graze, we eat constantly. When you eat, and we eat a lot of carbohydrates, it turns directly into glucose, which burns in our blood, which is in our blood. And we burn glucose first. When you have glucose in your blood, your body, your pancreas, produces insulin. Insulin has two roles. It tells your body to burn the glucose, and it tells your body to put some of that glucose into your fat. It also prevents your fat from burning so that you can burn the glucose. When we eat a snack just before we go to bed and have sugar in our coffee right when we wake up, we have maybe a 6 to 7 hour window where we're not eating. That's barely enough time to finish our digestion and not even enough time to burn all our glucose. What this means is our digestive systems are constantly working, and we almost always have insulin in our bodies, which leads to insulin resistance, which many of us have. Fatty liver disease used to be commonly associated with alcoholism because the way alcohol metabolizes, the liver metabolizes alcohol. Today there's an epidemic of fatty liver disease in kids who aren't drinking. It's from soda. I have a friend who literally, he has to convince his doctor he doesn't drink because his liver is so diseased with this because of soda. And this isn't just a few people, this is becoming an epidemic in our country, and it's because of the way we eat these calories. And so I found with my time-restricted eating, by not eating a single calorie after 7 p.m., and not eating a single calorie before, even my coffee is black. So water, coffee, or tea, nothing sweetened, nothing to chew, nothing to eat, but have a window of at least 14 hours. It lets my body digestive system shut down, and it lets me burn off all the glucose. And then when I exercise and sweat in the morning before I eat, I'm actually burning fat. And I found time-restricted eating covers a lot of sins. So when I travel and I can't eat as healthy as I want, or I can't exercise as much as I want, but I keep my time-restricted eating, I do that fairly well when I travel. There's been times I've come home, I'm like, I'm sure I've gained 3 pounds, at least. And I almost have never gained weight. Time-restricted eating actually is a great way, and even the way it's advocated and talked about, it's a great way to kind of maintain your diet and your health. Sleep is something I've worked very, very hard to change. I can live on 5 hours of sleep. If you read the book Why We Sleep, I think Dr. Walker's the author of that book. That's a great book. A, it will scare the crap out of you. But B, it will show you all of the tremendous benefits for your body. He said in the book, he said, if there was a drug that offered even half of the benefits that sleep had, it would be the most sought-after drug in the world. If we just understood how over the top beneficial sleep is for us, we would crave it. And then the last one was breath. When I was researching breath, I said to my dad, didn't even tell him what I was studying, what I was looking at. I just, out of the blue, I said, Dad, what did Grandpa teach you about breathing? He said, you're supposed to breathe through your nose. Our people use cradle boards for our babies. Remember the description they gave of cradle boards in the book? I never knew this until I read that book. The cradle board holds your head up straight and flat. What that does is it doesn't allow you to open your mouth when you sleep. You have to put your head back. When your head's forward, you can't open it near as much. We were training our kids since birth how to breathe through our noses instead of our mouths. I've been retraining myself how to breathe. I literally tape my mouth shut every night to teach myself how to breathe through my nose instead of through my mouth. I have been working tirelessly over the past year and a half to decolonize my faith or decolonize my health. It's blown my mind how so many of the chronic sicknesses we struggle with come from our colonial lifestyles. Our processed foods, our constant distraction of our social media and our lights. We've wrecked our circadian rhythms. We don't sleep well, we don't breathe well, we don't eat well, we don't move. I walk anywhere between 15 and 25,000 steps a day. I take phone calls for meetings. I'm teaching myself how to write my books by dictation so I can talk on my phone dictate my book while I'm walking. I walk to my office every day and back. I walk between 6 and 10 miles a day. And this takes time. This takes time. It's so much easier to exercise for 30 minutes in the morning. It takes time to move throughout the day. But I look back at what my elders did. They would wake up, they would herd the sheep, they would cut the firewood. They would be constantly moving throughout the day. It's our culture of convenience and our linear perception of time that leads us to schedule things out instead of doing them until we complete the task. And living healthy, there's a great phrase I read. It said, right, you can either pay the farmer or the pharmacist. It's going to cost you one way or the other. You can either pay the farmer for healthier, more real, less processed food today, or you can pay the pharmacist tomorrow because of the chronic diseases that we all suffer with. And it's the same thing with our time. If there is no convenient way to be healthy. Most of our chronic health diseases come from our search for convenient ways to do things. It takes time to make these changes, to lose this weight, to do these things. It doesn't happen overnight. And we have to just be willing to put in that time, be willing to move forward with those things. I want to talk for a moment about this book, Why We Get Fat. This book is an absolute paradigm shift. I've just finished reading it for the third time. It completely flips the understanding of diet and exercise as involved in weight gain and weight loss. The first time I read it, I'm like, that's a compelling argument. The second time I read it, I'm like, okay, you convinced me. I read it a third time, and I'm like, I have to understand this. I'm not able to make this argument that they make in this book, but basically they say diet and exercise has almost no bearing on your weight loss. This advocates for a low-carb, high-protein, high-fat diet. It's the one book that actually made me change my diet. I lost 50 pounds eating ice cream every night and tortillas every day. But this book, reading this book, actually compelled me to change my diet. I highly recommend it, if for nothing else, just to get some of those thoughts into your mind. I want to go back to this quote by Katie Bowman. When you live in an elder-free society, you have to turn somewhere, and scientific data is where many of us are turning. And my message to you tonight is you don't need to live in an elder-free society. I've been going around the country talking about health for the past 2 months. I lectured at the University of Alabama Medical Center a month ago. Spoke to some of their med students about indigenous health and wisdom versus scientific data. And my message to you is you don't have to live in an elder-free society. When I go out and I teach non-native peoples, I have to teach them about health. When I talk to indigenous peoples, I don't have to teach them about health. I just have to remind them. Western culture has lost its elders. They've lost their sense of being indigenous. They don't know where they've come from or even who they are by and large. Indigenous peoples know we have these stories still. We know how our ancestors lived. We know what they did. We know how they ate. We know how they moved. We know all these things, and we can easily understand them and incorporate them back into our lives. And so going back to the metaphor of the grandmother in the house, after you go up and say thank you, acknowledging that this is not your house, the conversation you can have over time with the elders in that room is gaining an understanding about how to be healthy, about how to live well within this land that we and our ancestors have been living in for tens of thousands of years. You do not need to live in an elder-free society. There are still elders here that you have access to. And initiating those dialogues, having those conversations, taking that posture can be your first step towards decolonizing. And will lead you into a lot of the harder steps we need to take to address the other issues of decolonization. I want to thank you for giving me some time to talk with you about these things tonight. It's been an honor to be here for a few minutes and to share these thoughts with you. So, my relatives, thank you very much. It's up to you.
Let's see. We actually have books outside that we want to make sure that people have time to go check in and to purchase, and also to check in with Mark personally. So we want to make time for that. So we were going to have a Q&A, but I think in the interest of making sure that we have enough time to do that other portion, we're going to be moving into the lobby to be able to do that. To close up our time, we're actually going to do something that I think is very relevant, which is a breath prayer. Breath prayer is a very old Christian practice, and it's something that the evangelicals haven't done for very long because we are divorced from our bodies, right? We do things that are on a spiritual, heady level, and our bodies aren't involved. And I think breath prayer is a way to reintegrate our bodies into our spiritual lives. They don't feel separate. And they also allow us to live in tension, because breath is tension. You can't just do one thing in breath. You have to do the other. And it's by doing both those things that you actually have the whole, right? And so I think a lot of breath prayer kind of resonates with this sense of being in balance, not just knowing one truth, but knowing a counterbalancing truth as well. And so we're going to close with breath prayer together. And then Mark's going to run to the other room and do more talking and more teaching from over there. With breath prayer, we traditionally use one phrase to kind of guide us as we breathe in, and then another phrase as we breathe out. And we're going to breathe out of our noses. I don't know if you're going to plan to do that or not, but today we are all going to breathe out of our noses as we do this. Okay, sorry. I don't know. I'm when you're talking about breathing, I'm the worst at that, so I've got some training to do. But what I'm going to say is the phrase, the truth will set us free. All right? Because we're talking about truth that are hard, that are not always easy to accept. And we got to understand and take in the truth, but with the understanding, this sets us free. We're better off knowing the truth, as hard as it might be. And so I'll say the truth, and we're going to breathe in deeply through our noses. And when I say will set us free, we're going to release that through our mouths. Let's just close our eyes and do that together. The truth will set us free. The truth will set us free. And once more, the truth will set us free. God, we thank you for our elders. We thank you for the wisdom you have poured out into creation and you have revealed to so many people. God, give us the humility to admit when we are wrong. Give us humility to repent for the things that we have done incorrectly. And give us the wisdom to turn to the wisdom of those who have come before us. We're so grateful for Mark Charles and for so many elders in this country who have so much to teach us, God. We say thank you. We acknowledge this house is not our own, and we ask to learn from their wisdom, both now and in the future. And we pray for your blessing upon us as we close this evening together. And we pray for your blessing in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for joining us. Please go in peace.
Angels we have heard on high, sweetly singing all the plain, and the mountains in reply, echoing their joyous strain. Angels we have heard on high, across the